Okay, Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Welcome to an amazing, long-awaited Saturday session. It's been really hard to be away. I'm so grateful to be here. Thank you to everyone who sent beautiful messages, prayers, love, support while Sheikh was very ill. It's definitely, the test of illness is so difficult, and you're just always so grateful when you come out the other end. I'm really, really grateful to be here for Surah Al-Tahrim. I just wanted to remind, first of all, a little bit of housekeeping. Tomorrow, actually, Sheikh is going to have an amazing conversation with Muhammadu Salahi. This is going to be an event that is hosted by the Noor Center in Canada, and it's going to be on their YouTube channel, but we will definitely get the recording afterwards as well if you can't make it. It's tomorrow at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. And if you don't know who Muhammadu Salahi is, he wrote a book called The Guantanamo Diary. He is a Guantanamo survivor. He was there for many, many years. The book was then revised and called The Mauritanian, and which was then turned into an actual movie with Jodie Foster and Benedict Cumberbatch, and I think it was released in 2021. And so this is, they're going to be talking about Islam and beauty and justice, and certainly some of the experiences that he had at Guantanamo, but also the legal case that he's involved in now, because I believe he is suing the Canadian government for their role in complicity in his experience and imprisonment in Guantanamo. So it should be a very, very powerful conversation. If you've seen some of the conversations before that were hosted by Noor Center, you know Aziza Kanji. She's an amazing journalist and moderator, and so she will be moderating that conversation. So definitely you can find it on YouTube under the Noor Center, NOORCENTRE in Canada, or you can go to our website or look at any of our emails and social media that we've been sending out, and you can find the link. So I also wanted to call attention, as always, to the incredible khutbah yesterday, the first one back in a while. There's so much obviously happening in the world. I think people know that now Gaza is getting bombarded. More people have died. Sheikh talked about that. And he also talked about some experiences. We actually, in this time that we were away, we lost one of our dogs who had been with us for almost 15 years. Her name is Baby, and I brought a picture. So I think some people probably recognize her, because I've shared her picture before on social media and in the weekly email, because we actually, she got very ill and we thought we were going to lose her a few years ago when we were in California. We actually didn't think she was going to make the trip all the way here to Ohio. Thankfully, she did. She's a really strong puppy, or she was a strong puppy. She survived her the illness that almost took her down. She actually had a really bad infection, and then later she developed cancer of the throat, and that was eventually what took her. And I, the important thing about the reference to Baby and the dog is that, the title of the khutbah is called "It's a Dog's Life," reflecting on the right to life and mercy. And it was a beautiful analogy that the Sheikh used to talk about, like what is owed to the creation of God, among them obviously beautiful dogs, and also reflecting on, when we care for, or how we've been caring for dogs, and how to think about what happens to Muslims, to people, around the world, and their right to life and their right to mercy. So it was a very powerful khutbah, and I thought that there's so much to say always, and especially even being away for 2 weeks, there's just so many things that happen in the world that we wanted to comment on. But I thought I would take this opportunity to just share some dog stories, because certainly I was really excited. I didn't know that he was going to talk about our dogs yesterday in the khutbah, and I'm sure that there are probably not many khutbahs around the world or around the country that actually talk about dogs, and especially in light of a loving, beautiful, merciful way. So it was, one of the things that I've really wanted to do through like Usuli, or through the work that we do, is just to elevate the position of dogs and animals, but dogs in particular, because I think that with Muslims, for me personally, it's really obscene that Muslims are the ones that are known to be anti-dog. And I understand all of that, but part of our work here is to try and educate people that that really should not be the case. You know, dogs are amazing creatures. Anyone who has spent any time with a dog or a cat or any other animal knows that they, you know, are a beautiful creation of God. And dogs in particular were programmed to literally love and care for us and serve us as human beings. I mean, there's, you know, people here, obviously the term man's best friend, but there is, you know, you could say so much more. And I wanted to share some of this because Sheikh and I, in our marriage of, you know, almost 3 decades, have rescued well over 50 dogs. And, you know, if you get to know them and you get to see them and you see how they interact with you, I mean, their love is so pure and so beautiful. It's like no other. I mean, their love to you is actually better than the love you'll get from most human beings, because it's so, it's, you know, there's no expectation. There's nothing but just pure joy when they see you. They want to be with you. You know, nothing makes them happier just to be in your presence. And, you know, you see even stories of people that abuse their dogs and their dogs still love them. I mean, obviously that is not not what I want to talk about, but, you know, the when you get to know, like, the complexity of these animals, it's amazing because each one is a unique creature with a unique personality. Research has been done to show that dogs in particular probably have like the development of a 2-year-old child. But, you know, so if you think about that, you know, how would you take care of your 2-year-old child? Because, you know, if you've had children or you've interacted with 2-year-olds, you know that they, even though they're very young, they're very complex and they feel a lot of emotions and they understand things, and they certainly understand love, and they certainly understand what it means not to be loved and to be neglected. And so, you know, our dogs have been an amazing even education into life and understanding humanity and people. And I had the great blessing of actually sitting with baby all the way through her last breaths. She had cancer. She got cancer when she was late stage, so she died when she was 15. She probably got it when she was about 13. And it was the type of cancer that grew in her throat. And so it was slowly, you know, collapsing her passageway. So her ability to breathe became, you know, worse over time. And so we noticed that her breathing became more labored. And, you know, it's difficult. You imagine someone slowly suffocating you. But we made the very, you know, important decision. It was a very difficult decision. I mean, we could have gone the route where we, you know, subject her to whether it's, you know, surgeries, recovery, anesthesia. You know, for dogs at that age, they're like very, very old, and you don't know how much they will suffer in terms of pain from a procedure like that, or you know, will be able, or to the ability to which they can heal. So we made the decision that we would just try to make her as comfortable as possible. And thankfully, you know, it was about a week ago Sunday, where she just declined very quickly within the last day of her life. And that honestly is a mercy and a blessing. You know, if anyone has had pets and has had to struggle with what to do, you know, one of the worst things about having, you know, these creatures that you love is that they live short lives, and that those lives come to an end, and you have to oftentimes decide what to do, especially if they're not dying from natural causes, but they have, you know, an illness, or you see that they're suffering, or that they've lost their ability to walk, or something like that. And I believe that these are all lessons for us as human beings, because they're reminders that one day this will also be us. You know, we could be the ones that are struggling with an illness, or suffering from an inability to walk. And so, you know, and then obviously death. And so when you see death before you, and, you know, with us having rescued so many dogs, we've seen a lot of death. They're important reminders for how to be merciful and how to care. And you imagine, you know, a 2-year-old, you know, in their last moments of life. You know, I wanted to be sitting next to baby, petting her, making sure she didn't feel alone. And it's, again, a reminder, none of us want to die alone. So, you know, this was, you know, if nothing else, just to share, like, you know, dogs are not just animals that you can, you know, set aside, or, you know, put to sleep when it's inconvenient for you because they demand more of your time or care or your money. This is what Sheikh talked about in the khutbah yesterday. But they have a right to life, and they have a right to care, and they have a right to live comfortably all the way through to the end. Right now we have Oso, who is 17. He's a husky, an amazing dog. We rescued him when he was 8 years old back in 2013. When we got him, he had been left behind. I think his previous owner had gotten old and ill and couldn't take care of him anymore. He had cancer, and so we had to have the vet remove that cancer. And then over time, he's just gotten old. He's just super old. I mean, life expectancy for a husky is between 12 and 15 years. So for him to reach the age of 17 is pretty amazing. And, alhamdulillah, most of the dogs that we've had have not wanted to leave us. So they get really, really old. And Oso now is at a stage where he literally, when he's awake, he cries because if he's laying down, he can't get himself up. So, one of us in the family, mostly me, will have to go and help him stand up. And once he's actually up, he's okay. But he just kind of gets tangled in himself. And so, he's got so much spirit and life. He's just like, like a 120-year-old man that can't get up from his chair. So it's like, if I hear him crying, I have to go, And so the thought of like, a lot of people would probably just put Oso to sleep. But I can't imagine, because he's just the most beautiful creature, and he's just nothing but pure love. So I hope that Muslims, will. I mean, I've heard, actually, I want to share this story too. Our niece told me that she came across one of her friends who was like, oh my God, I'm so grateful to your uncle because I watched some of his videos about dogs and the permissibility of dogs, and I just married, a convert who had a dog, and we were able to keep him just because of the videos that you do here. And that's like the kind of story that makes me so happy, because I think Muslims should be on the front line of advocating for dogs and dog ownership and loving dogs and recognizing the absolute divinity of each dog and the love they bring, the loyalty, the complexity, the sense of humor. Honestly, the things that God has designed dogs to do, or cats or anything, they just make you laugh. They cheer you up. They're with you. They're non-judgmental. They don't expect anything from you. They're just, they just make your life better. They really transform your life. So I hope that dogs will, that Muslims will come to learn and embrace ownership of a dog, and not to think of them just as a dog, but to think of them as a family member, a friend, your closest companion, your connection to God, because God speaks through our dogs to us every single day. And if we pay attention and we listen, there's just so much to learn from how they are, how they treat us. They teach us how to be better human beings ourselves. So if nothing else, if you're thinking about getting a dog, get one, start small, and work your way up, because, I know that Muslims have a lot of baggage to overcome in terms of fear of dogs. And we've definitely had our own strategy. We always would show, people might know Lucci, our little Maltese. He's in one of our little prayer videos. So anytime people would come that were scared of dogs, we would always introduce them to Lucci, and Lucci was like the gateway dog. So you meet Lucci, Lucci's non-threatening, very cute, and it starts unlocking the fear and opening the love. So we've definitely converted a lot of people, even within our own family, who were scared of dogs, and made them into dog lovers. And I think that's really, we're here to care for God's creatures. So, dogs are amazing. And again, we're a gift, honestly, to all of us. So that's it. I just, I hope that people will watch yesterday's khutbah, because it was really powerful to understand the lens of what's happening in our world with our brothers and sisters, through the lens of caring for an animal. With that, I hope that everyone will keep Gaza and all the Muslims around the world that are suffering in their prayers. And I'm looking so forward to another meeting of beauty and understanding Surah Tahrim, which I'm sure will be absolutely stunning. So thank you for joining us. Again, thank you for everyone's prayers. Happy to be back, and looking forward to another amazing session.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Subhanallah al-Ali al-Azim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalam ala Muhammad wa ala alih al-Athar al-Tayyibin wa ala ashabi al-Mukhtarin. وعلى من اتبعوا بإحسان إلى يوم الدين. اللهم اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي يا رب العالمين. Because we have not had, because we've had to skip a few halaqas, I've decided that instead of doing the Q&A on Surah Al-Ahzab, to go ahead and do a new surah today, and then inshallah perhaps combine the Q&A with Surah Al-Ahzab with Surah Al-Tahrim. So inshallah today is Surah Al-Tahrim. So there is going to be quite a bit of, before jumping into the substance, quite a bit of situating Surah Al-Tahrim, because it is significant and it raises some very interesting historical questions similar to Surah Al-Ahzab, the type of questions that we've already encountered to an extent in Surah Al-Ahzab. Okay. So Surah Al-Tahrim is a late Medinian surah. The likelihood is that it was revealed in the 7th Hijri year. Seventh, for many different reasons, is the most likely year of revelation. Now, there are interesting the reports that often will tell us the order of revelation. This is a genre of reports that tell you this surah was revealed in this surah, then this surah, and so on. Will often assert that Surah Al-Tahrim was number 107 in order of revelation. And in fact, these reports will often claim that it was revealed after Surah Al-Hujurat and right before Surah Al-Taghabun. So, sort of positioned between Al-Hujurat and Al-Taghabun. Both surah we've covered. But these reports these chronological reports are not reliable because it is most certain that Al-Hujurat, for instance, was revealed after Al-Tahrim, not before Al-Tahrim. And Al-Taghabun most certainly was revealed before Surah Al-Tahrim and not after Surah Al-Tahrim. Al-Hujurat, which we've talked about, was quite likely revealed the 9th Hijrah, 8th or 9th Hijrah, and Al-Taghabun revealed in the first 3 or 4 years of Hijrah, in the 3rd or 4th Hijri year. So when we get these narratives that tell us about the chronology of Surah, when we often delve into the details of these narratives, we discover that the layout of the chronology, and we've had many examples of this already in many different situations, that we can't rely on the chronology as narrated. But as we've often done, we can often, through various indicators, reach a type of opinion. We can come to a conviction that a particular surah was revealed within a particular year. And in the case of Surah Al-Tahrim, as I said, it is most likely that it is in the seventh Hijri year. Um, and after Surah, definitely after Surah Al-Ahzab, um, which is the last surah we've covered, um, probably, for instance, a year or two after Al-Ahzab, um, and in all likelihood, right before Surah Al-Mumtahina, which we did not cover. Okay. So this is in terms of the chronology of the surah. And right away, when dealing with Surah Al-Tahrim, we are struck by the range of reports about the asbab al-nuzul, or occasion for revelation. And here we will spend some time unpacking this, because it is also relevant to the meaning and the message of Surah Al-Tahrim itself. So Surah Al-Tahrim starts out, if you remember in Surah Al-Ahzab, the beginning is Allah talking to the Prophet ﷺ and invoking the Prophet towards ittaqa'illah, to have an ever-present consciousness of Allah, and to be resolute in this consciousness. Surah Al-Tahrim starts out again with a rather abrupt, powerful beginning, where Allah, speaking to the Prophet, tells the Prophet, why is it, or perhaps even criticizes the Prophet or chides the Prophet for caving in to social pressure, in this case, caving into pressure from his family, his wives, and prohibiting upon himself something that is allowed. So the opening language, يا أيها النبي لما تحرم ما أحل الله لك, right? So why do you, and it's, why do you, out of a desire to please your wives, تبتغي مرضات أزواجك, why do you, out of a desire to please your wives, prohibit something that God has made lawful to you? And when you make something prohibited, that is called tahrim. Tahrim is when you declare something not to be allowed. Tahrim could be legitimate or illegitimate. Tahrim al-shay, to declare something prohibited, could be legitimate or illegitimate. And what makes it legitimate or illegitimate is the basis for the tahrim. If it's authorized by God, then it is legitimate. If it is not authorized, then it is acting without authority. The very beginning of Surah Al-Tahrim and the very gist of Surah Al-Tahrim is that it is a grave matter. It is a very serious issue to take something that is allowable, that is permissible, and to make it impermissible. Now, it would not be if you refrain from engaging in something that is permissible out of personal taste. So, in other words, you are not claiming that your position has normative value. You are not claiming that your exercise of personal taste carries authoritative weight, carries normative weight. That is not a matter of concern for tashri'ah, for law, for jurisprudence. Your exercise of your personal taste and personal autonomy, as long as you are not making a normative claim, is something between you and God. Where it does have serious consequences is when the tahrim, when the act of declaring something permissible, impermissible, has normative weight. So, in other words, it might in fact be a representation. You are making a representation about a will that is not yours, i.e., God's will. It's one thing if you are just saying, this is my own personal will, and this is a matter between me and God. It's a closed matter. There's a closed circuit between you and your maker. But it is when the claim that is made goes beyond this closed circuit, and you are not representing your own personal will or personal taste, but you are making a representation about what God wants or God does not want. Now, so this strikes us at the very beginning of Surah Al-Tahrim as an issue. And we will, you'll better understand why in a second, but as a prima facie matter, as a sort of at the very outstart of the matter, why is it an issue? Well, if the Prophet because of his interactions with his wives engaged in or abstained from doing some act, or promised not to do some act, we really don't get to the issue of tahrim unless there was normative implications to what the Prophet did. So again, let's, for example, say, as we will see in a second, let's say the Prophet ﷺ says to his wives, "By God, I will never eat XYZ." Is that tahrim? Well, if all he said is, for whatever reason, between him and his wives, all he said is, "I will not consume X, Y, or Z," and that's all he said, that is not tahrim. That is an expression of a personal preference that has nothing to do with God's will. However, if what he said brings in the divine will in some form or another, then the issue of tahrim is involved. And we will see why this is important in trying to go through the various narrations as to what occasioned Surah Al-Tahrim. So from, Allah is talking to the Prophet, saying to the Prophet, why do you, in order to please your wives, do something you're not supposed to do? And what is this something that you're not supposed to do? You are making something prohibited. And the challenge, though, is that the narrations about the story behind Surah Al-Tahrim, as you'll see in a second, raise credibility issues, interpretive issues. So this will become clear as I go through the narratives for occasions for revelations. Okay. So what is striking is that there is an occasion, there is an event that happened, or a set of events that happened between the Prophet ﷺ and his wives. It led to something dramatic, and Allah intervenes in this by underscoring that matters of halal and haram, matters of making what is permissible haram or what is haram halal, is too serious to be left to personal tastes and personal dynamics. It should never be a matter of personal accommodations or personal preferences. Halal and haram involves the will of the legislature, the will of God, and the authorization for halal and haram can only come from that source. So then, of course, that begs the question, well, what happened? And what you find quite surprising about Surah Al-Tahrim is the range of narratives, the extremely wide range of narratives about what happened. And this is something that, we'll get into this in a little bit, but something that has been noticed by a number of commentators. So let's go through some of the most famous ones. So we have a whole block of narratives that claim. Oh, there's one other thing that I should introduce before going through those narratives. There's another element to what the Quran says, is that Surah Al-Tahrim doesn't just talk about a, an accommodation that was offensive to God, some type of carrying favors with the wives that God did not approve of, but it also talks about some secret that was revealed. There was the Prophet ﷺ apparently tells one or more of his wives something, and this, whatever was told, was communicated, and by the terms of the surah itself, it's وَإِذَا أَثَرَ النَّبِيِّ إِلَى بَعْضِ أَزْوَاجِهِ. So this is verse 3. It so happened that the Prophet told something in confidence to one of his wives, and when she thereupon divulged it, and God made this known to him, he told others about he mentioned the communication that took place. He mentioned some of it and didn't talk about other parts of it. So Muhammad Asad translates it as he acquainted others with some of it and passed over some of it. Meaning that he didn't come and say, well, he didn't confront whoever this person was about the full confidence that was broken. He only confronted this person about part of the confidence that was broken. Okay? And then the wife says, who told you, who informed you that I in fact broke that confidence? And the answer from the Quran is, well, God is the one who told me. And so this is another element to the narrative. The surah itself doesn't give us any details. It doesn't tell us what the tahrim was. It doesn't tell us what the specifics of the events were. It doesn't tell us what was the confidence or the secret. It doesn't tell us what confidence was broken. It alludes to these events, but doesn't explain any of them. And that is why then you go to the traditions to try to understand whether the traditions in fact can explain to you what Surah Al-Tahrim is alluding to. So then we have a whole cluster of narratives that say these are known, we can call them the Maria clusters of narratives. According to this cluster, that the Prophet ﷺ was in Hafsa's quarters. Hafsa is one of his wives, the daughter of Umar ibn al-Khattab, and that he was in Hafsa's quarters, and Hafsa is not present in her quarters, and she goes, the narratives differ as to where Hafsa was at the time, whether she went to visit her parents or she went to the market, or there are a whole range of them. Okay. And that for some reason that the narratives don't really explain to us, that the Prophet is at Hafsa's quarters with Maria the Copt, who was given to him as a slave girl. And according to this cluster, that some narratives claim that there was a sexual encounter between the Prophet ﷺ and Maria in Hafsa's quarters. Some claim that it wasn't a sexual encounter, but that he was present with Maria, known for at least until she becomes a Muslim, as Maria the Copt. That he's present regardless of the specifics, that Hafsa is upset that the Prophet is with Maria in her quarters. And she confronts the Prophet about this and says, basically, why are you with Maria in my quarters? This is my space. This is my bed. Well, they didn't have a bed, but my sleeping quarters. And from there is something that is odd, to say the least, about these cluster of narratives. So if we understand, if we can get over the fact that we know from other narratives that Maria had her own quarters. We know that from the time that Maria came to the Prophet's household. And we have descriptions as to where Maria's quarters were. So, but if we get over the fact that why is Maria with the Prophet in Hafsa's quarters? And of course, well, anyway, I'll come back to this. There's another element to these narratives that then strikes us as rather very odd. Is that when Hafsa confronts the Prophet about this, he is very worried that Aisha would find out about the event. Well, if it's Hafsa's quarters, why would he be worried that Aisha would find out? Well, these narratives tell us that for some reason that the narratives don't explain, that he was with Maria in Hafsa's quarters on a day that belonged to Aisha. That on a day that was supposed to be Aisha's. So the Prophet tells Hafsa, tries to appease Hafsa, and Hafsa's upset, and he tells Hafsa, don't mention this to Aisha. And if you don't mention this to Aisha, and promises, if Hafsa doesn't mention this to Aisha, that he will never touch Maria again. Okay. That he will never touch Maria again. And that Hafsa goes ahead and in fact informs Aisha, tells Aisha about the incident. And according to this cluster, then we are told that this is what occasioned, this is the tahrim that 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 Surah Al-Tahrim is talking about. And so, of course, that begs the question, well, even if this did happen, where is the tahrim? Where is what is making permissible impermissible? And the answer typically given is that because the Prophet swore or took an oath not to touch Maria. There is a further element in this cluster of reports that rather make these reports even more interesting. We are told in all the versions of these reports that involve Maria, Hafsa, a sexual encounter of or khalwa, regardless. And don't tell Aisha. Aisha is told is that at this point the Prophet ﷺ tells Hafsa, not only will I promise not to ever touch Maria again, but let me tell you a secret. What is the secret? After I die, Aisha's father is going to become the Khalifa after me, and then your father will become the Khalifa after me. And Hafsa is so excited with this news that she is unable to keep it a secret, and she goes and tells Aisha, let me tell you what the Prophet just told me. After he dies, Abu Bakr will become the Khalifa, and Umar will become the Khalifa. As the language goes, اكتمي علي وأبشرك أن أبا بكر وعمر يملكان بعدي. That's the Now, there are variations within these narratives that when the Prophet learns that Hafsa broke the confidence and in fact went ahead and told Aisha that Abu Bakr is going to be the Khalifa after him and then Umar, and that now the rumors have started spreading in the community that, the secret is out, that the Prophet is so upset that he divorces Hafsa. And then that he is commanded by Angel Gabriel, to go back on the divorce. He is told, basically, no, she's going to be your wife in Jannah, so you can't divorce her. So he goes back on the divorce. Okay. In all the variations, there are many minor variations in these reports about the Hafsa, this basic building block. The Hafsa, the Maria, the Aisha. None of these narratives are of solid reliability. There are, but But even other than the matter of isnad, even other than the matter of isnad, as people like Al-Razi, for instance, have pointed out, that the ضعف al-isnad, or the weakness in chains of transmission, is one thing, but the historical positioning of these reports are suspect. So we have these questions about, well, why Maria in Hafsa's quarters? Why Aisha? Why is the Prophet so worried about Aisha finding out about him being with Maria when it was an open matter? It was no secret that and all the reports that inject an element, a political element, where the matter of the Khilafah seemed to be resolved in favor of Abu Bakr and Umar, are suffer or have the characteristic, in terms of who narrated these reports, of being among what are known as the Nawasib reports. The people who narrated these reports have all, in terms of their political careers, have sided with Muawiyah, supported the Umayyads, and opposed, or at least did not support, Ali and Ahlul Bayt. There is another element that a scholar like Farhan al-Malki, may Allah release him from prison, I completely agree with, and he has done a great job in emphasizing and investigating, is that there is a remarkable thing about these politicized reports. Farhan al-Malki noticed, and when reading him and looking at the same material, I completely agree, is that these reports always tend to not just support the Umayyads and support Muawiyah's faction, but suffer from a tendency to malign the character of the Prophet. Quite often, illogically. So, if you unpack this report, so you want us to believe that the Prophet takes Maria from her quarters, takes her to Hafsa's quarters, uses the opportunity that Hafsa is away, decides to use this opportunity to have sex with Maria in Hafsa's quarters, and then when she finds out and is upset about it, he basically wants her to lie or to keep a secret, which is icky and dishonest. Not at all what we know about his character. So, don't tell anyone. Please don't tell Aisha. Very slimy. Very slithery. Oh, don't tell Aisha. Don't tell Aisha. Oh, don't tell Aisha, and I'll tell you a big secret. Your father and Aisha's father and your father are going to become the Khalifa after me. if you dislike the Prophet, you'd be excited about a report like this. If you want to malign and slander the Prophet, you'd be excited about a report like this. And Farhan al-Malki is absolutely right that after the Prophet died, many of the people who claimed to convert to Islam and who established the Umayyad dynasty were Muslim in name only. And they carried a vendetta against the Prophet and Ahlul Bayt. The vendetta that they carried is that he defeated them. He defeated Quraysh. And there was an injection of a wave of reports that we have to be very honest about, are slanderous, unbecoming. Okay, so what other clusters exist? Well, there are clusters of reports that tell us, no, the issue was not Maria the Copt and Hafsa's quarters and all of that. The issue was that there was a woman who, if you remember, we talked about Hiba. This is a woman that goes to the Prophet and says, I want to marry you, and without a dowry. And that there's a sort of a low cluster of reports that say that a woman offered herself to the Prophet in this way, and that this upset, again, Hafsa and Aisha, and that the Prophet, when he saw Hafsa and Aisha get upset, he said, I promise I will never marry a woman who does this hiba procedure, or want to marry me without a dowry. And that's what the surah is talking about, that the promise made, and that God chides the Prophet for promising, making something haram. In other words, the haram here is that he promises, I will not marry when God hasn't set that restriction upon him. However, all the versions of this cluster are extremely weak, and so I don't know any scholar has accepted it even as potentially authentic. Now, okay. I forgot this. There's another complicating element. Many of the versions about the Maria, Hafsa, and Amra and Aisha clusters tell us that after the Prophet finds out that Hafsa revealed the secret, he is upset, and as a result, he stays in Maria's quarters, in Maria's home, for 29 days, isolates himself in Maria's home for 29 days, away from his other wives. Of course, that, raises some interesting historical questions. If it's at all true, the most simple and straightforward question is, well, if this is an issue that involved Hafsa and Aisha, why would he isolate himself from the rest of the wives? Well, it's like, well, it's not, even if he's mad at Hafsa and Aisha, how is it the other wives' fault? And why would he isolate himself in Maria's quarters in particular, considering the background, etc., etc.? Okay. Now, there is other reports, another cluster of reports that says, no, this had nothing to do with Maria, sexual encounter, none of that. But rather, these are known as you could call them the honey reports. That, and there are various versions of this. Some versions say that Salama had a pastry made of honey that the Prophet liked licking. You keep licking at it, and I don't know how to. Anyway, يلعق منها ويحب and so on. So the Salama pastry, honey pastry, right? There is the Sauda. Other versions say no, it wasn't Salama pastry, it was a pastry served by Sauda. Very similar in all other regards, a pastry made of honey that he would enjoy licking. But instead of Salama providing that pastry, it was Sauda who provided this pastry. Within that same cluster, I would put also the Zainab bint Jahsh reports, which said, no, it wasn't a pastry served by Salama or Sauda, it was a drink made of honey served by Zainab bin Jahsh. And that the Prophet liked that drink, and he liked it when Zainab bin Jahsh prepared the drink for him, and he would happily drink it. Okay, so how does this become an issue? Well, so this is the honey cluster, right? Whether pastry licking or honey drinking. The problem is, again, we get the same figures and same characters playing a role. Hafsa, Omar's daughter, and Aisha, Abu Bakr's daughter, and that they are jealous that the Prophet is either enjoying Salama's pastry or Sauda's pastry or Zainab's drink. And so they conspire that every time they know that the Prophet, depending on which version you accept, has either went and had that drink at Zainab's quarters or ate that pastry, is that they conspired to tell him that he had a foul odor attached to him. And that when they kept doing that, because the Prophet, it is that he cared a lot about, I think he had a sensitive nose, because we have a lot of reports about his sensitivity to obnoxious odors. That when Hafsa and Aisha complain about the bad odor, he swears, he promises that he will never drink that drink again or eat that pastry again. And that the entire Tahrim is precisely this: the promise not to drink or eat the pastry again. Now, in this cluster of reports, however, what is the secret that is being betrayed? There is allegedly a promise. Okay, since you complain about the way I smell, I swear I'm never going to touch this drink again. But what is the tahrim? Is it that he said, I swear I'm not going to touch this drink again? And so God is chiding him for taking an oath that he shouldn't take? Because he's not making something permissible prohibited. He is taking an oath that perhaps he shouldn't have taken. And what is the secret being betrayed? There's something very curious. This report about the Prophet not liking Hafsa and Aisha complaining about his odor doesn't make the Prophet look bad. It doesn't slander the Prophet. And lo and behold, when you look at the chain of transmissions, you don't find the Nawasib involved in the Nawasib are involved in the version of report, in the version that has the sexual encounter with Maria. At the same time, the slanderous reports all have that political element to it. But the non-slanderous reports, the honey versions, honey reports, do not have the political element to it. He doesn't go on to say, oh, and I'm going to tell you a secret. Abu Bakr and Omar are going to become the khulafa after me. But there is a problem with the honey reports. Well, many problems, but we don't know what the secret that was communicated or broken is. And it seems infantile and disproportionate. They tricked them into thinking that drinking honey, basically a drink made out of honey, results in a bad odor. And he believed them, and believed them so much so to actually swear never to touch that drink again. It has a comical or theatrical characteristic to it. Or he believed that actually licking this pastry made out of honey, this is a pastry that didn't require preservation. It hardened, it became sort of like hard bread, and you consume it by licking at it for a long time. And he actually then believed them that when he would lick this pastry, it resulted in a bad odor, and so much so it bothered him so much that he took an oath never to touch that pastry again. And even if this was true, why would it result in a crisis in the family and a complete a meltdown, if you will, within the family of the Prophet, that Allah would have to intervene? Now, why did I take the time to go through these reports? Because, of course, Islamophobes have jumped, and because Muslims have never taken ownership of their own tradition, never used their intellect to analytically go through their own tradition, Islamophobes found plenty of Muslims that just unthinkingly and uncritically repeat the Maria tradition and Hafsa's quarters, and it's slanderous. You can't. There's no way you're gonna make it look okay. It's slanderous. It doesn't make and this honest prophet who says, "Oh, don't tell Aisha, and I'll tell you something." It's horrible. Very much like what we encountered in Surah Al-Ahzab, the Zaid reports. And of course, Muslims, young Muslims who have no clue about anything, they read this material and on social media and whatever and by Islamophobes, and off they go into the mess they're in, and it's not their fault. It is the fault of the lack of serious scholarship in the Islamic tradition, because no people deal with their history with this level of lack of seriousness like Muslims do. Okay. So we've talked about three clusters, right? The Maria cluster, the honey cluster, and the third cluster, which most reject anyway, the Hiba cluster, the marriage without dowry cluster. And in my view, the evidence is rather very clear that it is very unlikely that any of these clusters explain to us what Surah Al-Tahrim is talking about. One is a highly politicized tradition that is slanderous. The second is a theatrical tradition that has the medieval characteristics of theater but lack of historical authenticity. And the third is just so off the wall about the Hiba that, not a single chain even is plausibly. So then we investigate further and we delve deeper, and we find within the cluster of traditions some less popular because they didn't have the same. Okay, let me explain this point. Narratives in history could be popularized because they described an historical event that people actually remembered, or they become popularized because they played a function. That function could be political, like the Khilafah of Umar and Abu Bakr type politicization, or that function could be something that the Qussas, the entertainers, back then it was, you didn't, obviously, you didn't have shows and circuses, and the entertainment were often storytellers that would go from one town to another singing the seerah of the Prophet. And the version about drinking honey, the honey cluster, was very popular among the storytellers, the Qussas. It was sort of it made people entertained. The Prophet enjoys something. These women conspire against the Prophet. He's fooled. The poor man who's fooled by his wives, and then poor Prophet, he promises not to consume something he loves. So it has all these emotional elements that the storytellers love to repeat. So these were popularized because they played these functions, either the political function or the storytelling function. But there are versions that were not popularized because they didn't play a function. One version that we actually already encountered claims that this verse was not about an oath taken by the prophet. It separates between the issue of Tahrim and the prophet trying to appease his wives in a way that was problematic. And it claims that Surah Al-Tahrim, when it says, قَدْ فَرَضَ لَكُمْ تَحِلَّةَ أَيْمَانِكُمْ, this is verse 2, that when God says, God has already enjoined upon you the expiation of your oath. So that if you make an oath and you find that this oath was not correct and you expatiate for it, that this was revealed because of an event that we've actually already encountered and talked about in Surah An-Nur. And that is remember when Abu Bakr promises or swears that he will no longer support Mistah because Mistah contributed to the slander of Aisha. And these reports say, well, this ayah, ayah number 2, قَدْ فَرَضَ لَكُمْ تَحِلَّةَ أَيْمَانِكُمْ, is talking about Abu Bakr's oath not to support Mistah and telling Abu Bakr that you should not have made that oath because you should continue supporting Mistah. So it comes from left field and tells us that the occasion is an event that we associate with a very different surah. Another cluster that is also not popularized tells us that no, the problem had nothing to do with Maria, had nothing to do with honey, had nothing to do with Hiba, had nothing to do with Abu Bakr and Mistah. The problem was التظاهر بين عائشة وحفصة في التحكم على النبي في النفقة. That Hafsa and Aisha made an alliance in which they consistently complained that about financial matters. That we've already encountered this genre of reports that now, after Muslims have been victorious in a number of battles, the financial affairs of Muslims have improved by the 7th Hijri year, but the financial conditions of the family of the Prophet has remained the same. There was no improvement in the finances of the Prophet's household, although the rest of the Muslim population seemed to be doing better, and that the wives of the Prophet consistently complain and start lobbying the Prophet about this matter until it reaches the point where he is sufficiently upset that it reaches a real breach. Now, the problem with these kinds of reports is that their non-specificity. We know that finances became an issue between the Prophet and his wives from the 5th Hijrah onwards. From the 5th year after Hijrah, they're saying, why is it that the migrants and the Ansar are doing better, but we live with very tight budgets? Why is it that, and there are, in by the way, variations on these reports, will have them complaining that the leaders of such and such tribe, the leaders of Al Ghasasina, as in one version, the complaint is that have you seen the leaders of the Ghassanid tribes, how they live and how their wives lives, and we live with. But we've already encountered that in Surah Al-Ahzab, and we know that this was already addressed specifically. So is it that it continued to percolate from Surah Al-Ahzab to Surah Al-Tahrim for 2 years? I mean, in Surah Al-Ahzab, Allah comes in and gives them a choice, right? And says, either you choose this world or you choose the Prophet. If you choose the Prophet, then forget about material wealth. And we are told in Surah Al-Ahzab that in fact they choose the Prophet. So the choice is made. So does it make sense that then 2 years later, that as these cluster of reports tell us, that التظاهر بين عائشة وحفصة في التحكم على النبي في النفقة, that Hafsa and Aisha somehow conspire to pressure the Prophet on matters of finances till it reaches? And if so, what is the tahrim? And what is the secret? There's another element, that this cluster of reports they belong to a genre of reports that tend to make sort of the anti-Aisha and anti-Hafsa reports that tend to do the instead of slandering the Prophet, they actually slander Aisha and slander Hafsa. In my methodology, I suspect these reports, because there is a political faction that had a vested interest in slandering Aisha. And so when I see this cluster of types of, or this genre, makes Aisha and Hafsa look bad. They, after 2 years after Surah Al-Ahzab, 2 years after they were given the choice, and they supposedly made the right choice, they're still conspiring to make the Prophet's life very difficult because of money. It's not very flattering towards them. And I must then be suspicious that there is a political motive behind these reports. Okay. I will give you go from question marks question because so far all I've raised are question marks, right? So we'll go from question marks to a possible answer. But let's take a 2 minute break. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Now, of course, someone like Al-Allam al-Tabtabai noted that all the traditions that claim to explain the occasion for revelation for Surah Al-Tahrim, none of them are reliable. Um, and that they in that yeah all the traditions that all the clusters that we've talked about so far. So let's now there I will go through a set of it's a long tradition narrated in um, narrated in very the different versions are very close to each other, but it's long, and I think it's important to translate it or paraphrase it because I do think it helps us contextualize Surah Al-Tahrim, and then it will also help us understand the point behind Surah Al-Tahrim. Okay, so I will not go. There are um, various chains of transmission, but they basically all tell us the basic set of events that we'll talk about. And so in this, Ibn Abbas reports that I knew that Surah Al-Tahrim addressed an event involving two of the Prophet's wives. Significantly, however, Ibn Abbas, according to this tradition, says, I did not know what events had transpired or who were the Prophet's wives involved. So Ibn Abbas, someone as close and as significant as Ibn Abbas, is telling us that it wasn't, to him, it was not common knowledge who Surah Al-Tahrim or who were the sort of the main characters involved in Surah Al-Tahrim. And that he then, during Hajj, he is at Hajj with Umar ibn al-Khattab, and that he used the opportunity that he is at Hajj with Umar ibn al-Khattab to approach Umar. Interestingly, all the reports for some reason mentioned that he waited for Omar. Omar went to the bathroom, and that he waited for him as he came back from bathroom and helped him do wudu or renew his wudu, and then he asked him. So Ibn Abbas says, so then I asked him, من المرأتان من أزواج النبي اللاتان قال الله إن تتوبا إلى الله فقد صغت قلوبكما فقال وعجب لك يا ابن عباس هما عائشة وحفصة. That he said, who are the two women that Allah is talking about in this surah? And Umar responds to Ibn Abbas and he says, well, they are indeed Hafsa, his daughter, and Aisha, Abu Bakr's daughter. But then Ibn Abbas says, ثم أنشأ يحدثني. But then he went on or continued on to tell me the story. So what does he tell him? So this is now Umar ibn Khattab speaking. It says, فقال كنا معشر قريش نغلب النساء فلما قدمنا المدينة وجدنا قوما تغلبهم نساؤهم فطفق نساؤنا يتعلمن من نسائهن فغضبت على امرأتي يوما فإذا هي تراجعني فأنكرت أن تراجعني فقالت ما تنكر من ذلك فوالله إن أزواج النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم لا يراجعنه وتهجره إحداهن اليوم إلى الليل قلت قد خابت من فعلت ذلك منهم وخسرت. So he says, we people of Mecca, men of Mecca, we used to be in control of our women until we came to Medina. And when we came to Medina, we found people who are controlled by their women. And that our women, our Meccan women, started being influenced by the Medinian women. They started becoming more bold and aggressive. And one day I got mad at my wife and she argued with me. And I told her, how dare you argue with me? And she said, well, the Prophet's wives argue with him, and they continue argue with him from day till night. And upon hearing this, I said, خابت من فعلت ذلك منهم. You know, it's like, it's like a, you know, maybe she be darned, whoever argues with the Prophet and does this. قال وكان منزلي بالعوالي وكان لي جار من الآثار كنا نتناوب على النزول إلى رسول الله. That I lived towards the upper Medina, and I had a neighbor who is from among the Ansar, the natives, and that we would always make sure that we check on the Prophet ﷺ. And we were very worried. وكنا نحدث أن غسان تنعل الخيل لتغزونا فجاء يوما فضرب على الباب. Anyway, so that we were very worried that these days that the tribe of Ghassan was getting ready to invade us. That our spies were telling us that they were preparing their horses and, you know, getting ready to wage an invasion against us. And my neighbor came and banged at my door, and I opened the door and I said, أجاءت غسان, did the Ghassanids, are they invading? قال أعظم من ذلك. No, it is even, the neighbor, Medinian neighbor said, no, it is even bigger than this. It is something more grave than this. So Omar said, what is it? And he said, the Prophet has divorced all his wives. قلت في نفسي قد خابت حفصة وخسرت قد كنت أرى ذلك كائنا فلما صلينا الصبح شددت على ثيابي. That upon hearing this, I said, what a big calamity, especially for Hafsa, his daughter. And I, according to Umar, he said, I sort of anticipated this is going to happen because of the rumors that he was hearing that they would argue with the Prophet. So after praying Fajr, the Subh, he got dressed and he went to Hafsa, and I found her sitting and crying. And I said to her, أطلقنا رسول الله, has the Prophet divorced you? قالت لا أدري هو ذا معتزل في المشربة فانطلقت فأتيت غلاما أسود. So she said, I don't know if he divorced us. He has isolated himself in the rest area. So he found a boy, a boy that served the Prophet ﷺ, and he said, can you ask permission for me to go in to see the Prophet? So the boy said, I mentioned you to the Prophet, قد ذكرتك له فلم يقل شيئا. I mentioned that you want to see him and he didn't respond, which, if you're sensitive, it's a grave matter. You're asking permission to see the Prophet and the Prophet doesn't respond. Okay. So he then فانطلقت إلى المسجد, and I found, so he went to the masjid, to the mosque, and he found that there are people sitting depressed in circles in the masjid. So I sat with them, but then I grew impatient. I needed to know. So I left them and went back to the Prophet's, to where the Prophet was. And then I told the boy, ask permission for me to see the Prophet. فقلت فأتيت الله مستأذن فدخل ثم خرج قال قد ذكرتك له فلم يقل شيئا فوليت ملتفت إلى الله يدعوني. So yeah, so then he said, the boy went in and he said, I mentioned I mentioned you to the Prophet. I said to the Prophet that you want to see him, and he didn't respond. And Omar then starts to leave, to walk away, when the boy calls him back and he says, no, come back. The Prophet does want to see you. So then Omar goes in and he sees the Prophet, قد رأيت أثرها في جنبه, that he had been lying on a hard mat that had left marks on his side. فقلت يا رسول الله أطلقت نسائك, did you divorce your wives? And he said, the Prophet said, no. قلت الله أكبر لو رأيتنا يا رسول الله وكنا معشر قريش نغلب النساء فلما قدمنا المدينة وجدنا قوما تغلبهم نساؤهم فطفق نساؤنا يتعلمن من نسائهن فغضبت يوما على امرأتي فهي إذا هي تراجعني فأنكرت ذلك فقالت ما تنكر فوالله إن أزواج النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم لا يراجعنه وتهجره إحداهن اليوم إلى الليل فقلت قد خاب من فعل ذلك منهن فدخلت علي حفصة فقلت أتراجع إحداكن رسول الله وتهجره اليوم إلى الليل قالت نعم فقلت قد خابت من فعلت ذلك منكن وخسرت أتأمن إحداكن أن يغضب الله عليها لغضب رسول الله فإذا هي قد هلكت فتبسم رسول الله. So he goes in, he sees the Prophet, and he starts telling him the entire story. He starts saying, you know, when we were in Mecca, we controlled our women. Then we came to Medina and we found people who are controlled by their women. And then one day I argued with my wife and I said, how dare you argue with me? And then she said, start telling her the whole narrative, telling him the whole narrative. And then she said, well, the Prophet's wives argue with him from day till night and even stop talking to him. And so if the Prophet's wives do this, you know, why can't I do this with you? And then I told her, may you be darned for doing this. And then I went to Hafsa and I asked her, Do you indeed argue with the Prophet from for hours on end, from day till night? And Hafsa said, yes, we in fact do that. So then I said, how dare you? Aren't you afraid that God would be would respond, or that God would be angry at you for the Prophet's anger with you? And seeing this whole thing that Omar starts telling gushing out with the Prophet ﷺ, the Prophet ends up smiling. Is smiling at probably at Omar's reactions and his. So then I told, when he saw that the Prophet smiled, then I told Hafsa, لا تراجعي رسول الله ولا تسألي شيئا وسليني ما بدا لك. Don't argue with the Prophet. If you have a problem, and don't ask him for anything. If you have anything you need, come ask me. Okay. Now, what's interesting is, so this conversation that goes on, where there are very different versions, where Hafsa, basically, either the Prophet tells Omar, don't intervene between me and Hafsa, or the Prophet is silent but smiles. But then the conversation, noticing that the Prophet is less burdened after this conversation, the conversation then moves on to, okay, Omar understanding that the nature of the tension in the Prophet's home that leads to these arguments is financial needs. And so he sort of jumps to the heart of the matter and tells the Prophet, why don't you pray to Allah? Why don't you ask Allah to ease your financial needs? And mentions, it says, Ya Rasulullah, ادعو الله أن يوسع على أمتك فقد وسع على فارس والروم. Indeed, he says, the Persians and Romans, they have, if you see the way they live, if Allah would just ease our needs, he means the Prophet's household. And the Prophet then reacts to this by completely rejecting the idea and standing firm at the idea that don't mention the Byzantines and Romans to me, because they live for dunya. Their priorities are different than ours. Our morality, our program is different than theirs, and so on. So it goes on. In Tabtaba, I'm reading this from Tabtaba, is because he mentions in many different versions of this report. So what do we get from this? That there are issues that are non-specified. So other than Omar confirming to Ibn Abbas in these versions that two women, Hafsa and Aisha, who have strong personalities, played a leading role. Salama, Sauda, Zainab are not leaders, are not born leaders. Hafsa and Aisha are. And that there is tensions in the Prophet's household that results in the Prophet withdrawing from his household, sort of isolating himself in a rest area. And clearly there is, the news reaches the entire community that the tensions has reached a breaking point. But in this genre of reports, we are not told what the Tahrim is. And we are not told what the secret was. And we are not told what the breaking of the confidence was. We're not given any details. And interestingly, although Ibn Abbas is asking Umar ibn al-Khattab, who are these two women? And Umar ibn al-Khattab tells him this entire story about gender dynamics. We used to control our women, then we came to a place where women control the men, and it tells him about the family problems that Omar witnessed in the household of the Prophet. Omar, in this cluster of reports, or this genre of reports, doesn't tell Ibn Abbas anything about what the confidences were, what the confidence was, what the oath was, what the tahrim was. So, in my view, the most historically credible and relevant cluster of narratives is in fact the Ibn Abbas, Umar ibn al-Khattab cluster. It's a cluster that tells us that there were serious family problems, serious family tensions that led the Prophet ﷺ to say something, either take an oath, make a promise, to say something to his wives that he shouldn't have, that we're not privy to, and reminding the wives of the Prophet that if they are surprised that the Prophet knows about what confidence they've broken or kept, that in fact it is because it is Allah that told the Prophet about this. In other words, what Surah Tahrim is saying about keeping confidence or breaking the confidence is not intended, it's not saying it to us. The target audience here is the wives of the Prophet, is to remind the wives of the Prophet that they are not married to a common man, they're not married to a regular person, but that in fact they are married to someone who has that connection with the heavens. And now, so why would Surah Tahrim want to alert us to a problem without giving us relief as to the details of the problem. And I would tell you that the answer is because it doesn't matter. The message of Surah Al-Tahrim, the issue is not what did the Prophet promise. The issue is not what was the confidence made, what was the confidence broken. That again, like Surah Al-Ahzab, that when it comes to the privacy of the Prophet, the realm of the private space of the Prophet, it is a very dangerous matter for us to try to base guidance or lack of guidance on what is historically inaccessible to us. Allah might have promised to protect the Quran, but Allah did not promise to protect the historical context of the Quran. What we need to know, Allah tells us in the Quran. Now, why does this matter? Okay, now let's go through the surah. So first, the narrative point. Your obligation is to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. What should take priority is not whether you are making your wives happy, but whether you are fulfilling your obligations towards Allah. So, يا أيها النبي لما تحرم ما أحل الله لك تبتغي مرضات أزواجك والله غفور رحيم. Why do you want to appease your wives by making whatever it is that you've promised, that you've engaged in? It is a grave matter to make something halal haram as it is to make something haram halal. The point to take here is that making something halal haram is a very serious matter. And you cannot engage in making something halal haram to appease a human being. If the Prophet cannot do it to appease his wives, a priori, none of us can do it to appease any other human being. Okay. And Allah reminds us that if you've made a promise, then expatriation, even for the Prophet, is the way that you retreat from an immoral promise. Just because you've compromised yourself, and because you've compromised yourself, you ended up making a promise that in retrospect was a wrong promise to make. It doesn't mean that you stick to your guns. Retreating because of principle is an immoral act in itself. And so you expatriate for the wrongful promise you've made, whatever the promise is. Okay. And then Allah reminds the wives of the Prophet, and this is a message to them. It's like in Surah Al-Ahzab where Allah reminds the wives of the Prophet, you are not like any other women. You have a very special status because you are the wives of a prophet of God. That when whatever the confidence that was communicated and was broken, And she says, who informed you that I've actually broke that confidence? And Allah responds, well, keep in mind here, Allah is fully involved in this because of the special relationship. Okay. And then Allah reminds again, and this is intended to the wives of the Prophet, in tatuba illa Allah faqad sagat qulubukuma وإن تظاهر عليه فإن الله هو مولاه وجبريل وصالح المؤمنين والملائكة بعد ذلك ظهير. This is 4. If you, in fact, fix your affairs with the Prophet, whatever these affairs were, and repent, then you are on God's side. If you don't, well, in the case of the Prophet, he is not just supported he is supported by the entire heavens. So, and if you uphold each other against them, in other words, if you continued being in the wrong, God is the Prophet's protector, and Gabriel, and the righteous among the believers, and all the other angels will come to his aid. This is uniquely for the Prophet. In the same way that, who told you that I told someone a secret, and the answer is, was God told me, is something that is uniquely for the Prophet. No other human being can claim that they are supported by Gabriel and the rest of the angels. And this is a special message to the wives of the Prophet. Like the message, you are not like any other woman, or like you are the mothers of the believers. It is a historically closed circle. It's a message that is a closed circuit between the Prophet and his wives, never to repeat, cannot extend beyond. It is from Allah to the wives of the Prophet, period. Okay. Then Allah gives them another message that reminds us of Surah Al-Ahzab. Perhaps, and says Asa Rabbuhu. Here, Asa, it is not that Allah is saying, in fact, Allah will do, but perhaps Allah will do, is that if He divorces any of you, that instead of you, spouses better than you, women who are, as the Muslimat, Mu'minat, Qanitat, Ta'ibat, Abidat, Sa'ihat, Thayyibat, that women who are truly devout, that God will replace you with women who are worthy of Him. Women who are truly devout, who are truly obedient to God, who truly worship with sincerity, and that whether these women be virgins or not virgins. Interestingly, Thayyibat wa Abkara, be they women previously married or virgins. In other words, it's immaterial whether they are virgins or previously married. Keep in mind that if you fail in the moral, to stand up to the moral station required of being spouses to the Prophet ﷺ, well, Allah could replace you with women who, in fact, rise to that moral station. That's the point. Okay. So, up to this point, it is an intervention in reminding the wives of the Prophet yes, you are with a man who doesn't pull rank with you. You are with a man whose nature is not like Umar ibn al-Khattab, who says, don't argue with me, or silent, and so on. Yes, he allows you to argue with him, and it has become sufficiently traumatic for him that he has withdrawn from all of you, basically taken a break. But sufficient breach that the rumor spread that he might have divorced you, and Allah intervenes and says, okay, get the point. This is not about you and him. This is about something much larger than you. So either you rise to the occasion of the moral challenge that is required to be married to this man, or you get out of the way and Allah will replace you. And up to this point, it is something quite, as I said, it's a closed circuit between a message directed at the wives of the Prophet. But then Surah Al-Tahrim takes us from there to something about relationships and family dynamics more broadly. And says, يا أيها الذين آمنوا قوا أنفسكم وأهليكم نارا وقودها الناس والحجارة عليها ملائكة غلاظ شداد لا يعصون الله ما أمرهم ويفعلون ما يؤمرون. So, believers, ward off from yourselves and those who are close to you fire of hell after, of the hereafter, whose fuel is human beings and stones. Lording or guarding this fire are angelic powers, awesome and severe, who do not disobey God in whatever God commands them, and always do what they are bidden to do. Your charge is to try to be an active force in your family, saving not just yourself, but your family from the consequences of moral failure. You have an obligation towards your family. To affirmatively help that family. Now, there are tons of ahadith, by the way, in this context, where the Prophet ﷺ is told, well, what if I tell my family to do X, Y, Z, and they don't answer? And the Prophet consistently responds, you discharge your obligation by educating them, and then it's their choice. And there are just so many of these ahadith that there's no point in, but they're all around the context of this ayah. Okay. Then Surah Al-Tahrim, after reminding us of our moral obligation towards those that are under our charge or under our influence within our family, that if you are truly moral, you do not simply take care of yourself and forget the fate of those who are close to you, but you are invested in their fate. Allah reminds us, notice, يا أيها الذين آمنوا توبوا إلى الله توبة نصوحا عسى ربكم أن يكفر عنكم سيئاتكم ويدخلكم جنات تجري من تحتها الأنهار يوم لا يخزي الله النبي والذين آمنوا معه نورهم يسعى بين أيديهم وبأيمانهم يقولون ربنا أتمم لنا نورنا واغفر لنا إنك على كل شيء قدير. So Allah reminds the believers that this is a moral project, and the moral project, something we've also encountered in Surah Al-Ahzab. Let's see the how he translates it. Okay, maybe so. The day on which God, this is Muhammad Asad's translation, the day on which God will not shame the Prophet and those who share his faith. Their light will spread rapidly before them and on their right, and they will pray, O our Sustainer, cause this our light to shine for us forever, and forgive us our sins. For verily thou hast the power to will anything. The language here, the objective is to get to a point of moral elevation, that it is as if your light flows between your hands. نورهم يسعى بين أيديهم. And the trajectory of their thought is they want an ever greater elevation in luminosity. This, of course, calls to memory everything the Quran has said about the role of light as an antidote for moral uprightness and moral purification. So let's pause for a second. The Prophet, his private life is his private life. But the aspects of the Prophet's lives that involve normative moral lessons, Allah underscores for us. And Allah reminds the Prophet that live a principled life and never, in order to appease your social circles, your family circles, make something that is halal haram or make something that is haram halal. Nearly all the scholars agree that it goes both ways. Yeah. While the Prophet has a special status, as do the wives of the Prophet, being the mothers of the believers, have a special status, the part that concerns us is that in your family relations, you have an affirmative obligation to do whatever within your capacity to elevate your family morally. In other words, to make your family about salvation. yeah, there's no coercion in religion. Yes, these ahadith say that you discharge your obligations once you've educate, but if you want, if your goal is the Nurani process, if your goal is the process of enlightenment and luminosity and blessing, then your family must be anchored on the principle that God is first and that God's objectives are first, not your whims, not your tastes. While we are not, while Gabriel will not aid any of us, or the angels will not aid any of us the way they aid the prophet, but we follow in the footsteps of the prophet. We approximate to the extent we can. So, as a number of scholars noted, that the goal of a husband and a wife in a family, while they cannot count, they can never assume that they have the powers of angels backing them up, but they must aspire and pray and supplicate. In other words, they hope for to reach the point of piety where in fact the powers of angels would back them up. This cannot be if your relationship is about your hawa, your tastes, your likes and dislikes, what makes you happy and what makes you happy. Well, Gabriel and the angels are not going to go to bat for you because of your whims. But if it is about the principle of upholding the Nurani principle, the luminous principle, that in this family, what we aspire for is that the light would flow between our hands and that Allah would ever increase the light in our lives with the sufficient humility and sufficient anchoring. In fact, that might be your fate. Now, look. Then Allah comes and reminds us of something that is painful. That this is now 10. ضرب الله مثلا للذين كفروا امرأة نوح وامرأة لوط كانت تحت عبدين من عبادنا صالحين فخانتاهما فلم يغنيا عنهما من الله شيئا. But remember, and here, look, the language changes. It's not the speech is not directed at the wives of the Prophet anymore. ضرب الله مثلا للذين كفروا. Allah is saying, I'm giving you an example now for the bad people. That even the prophets of God, the prophets here, Nuh and Lut, they were two pious people. But even prophets of God can be betrayed by treacherous people. These two women were married to two prophets of God, Abdain Salihain. They were truly pious people, and they betrayed them. And the fact that betrayed them, of course, the fact that they were married to pious people didn't help them. But there's another reminder in this, and this is something that is scholars have noted. People have commented on. So this is not mine. That you might, in fact, be traversing the path of the light. This might be your goal as a husband or as a wife, but you end up being betrayed by your spouse. You might end up being completely, treacherously betrayed by someone who has completely different priorities. You fall apart. Because in the same way that Allah gives you that example, Allah then says, وَضَرَبَ اللَّهُ مَثَلًا لِلَّذِينَ آمَنُوا. And in the same way, remember, there could be very pious husbands that end up with wives that are absolutely impious, and there could be very pious wives that end up with husbands that are absolutely impious. So this is whether husband or wife. It could be that the wife is intent on a Nurani path, but ends up completely betrayed by her husband. And it could be that the husband is intended on a Nurani path, but end up with an absolutely treacherous wife. The challenge in both cases, does it throw you off course or not? Because you can imagine that someone who, and all it would take, a betrayal, a treachery, a divorce, and they abandon everything. It happens all the time. The problem, how do I put it? The danger in collective enterprises, when you start preaching to people, okay, walk together in the path of God, hand in hand. The danger is always, since this was a collective enterprise from the beginning, is that if there is treachery or betrayal midway, then there would be a complete abandonment of the project, because you started out with a collective framework, and when you found the partnership has failed, you think, well, everything has failed. Nothing can work. That's a very real danger. And in Surah Tahrim, it uses the excuse, the occasion. If things can reach a near breaking point between the Prophet and his wives, with the Prophet's wives, Allah can come and threaten them and say, you know what, God will give him better wives, and they shape up. With you guys, it's not going to work that way. With you guys, you normal human beings, it's the principle that upholds you. And the principle, yes, the ideal is a partnership, a collectivity that you walk hand in hand, where God is first, not your whims, not your tastes, not your desires, but the possibility of one of you standing firm and the other falling apart is very real. And if that leads to the crashing of everything, that obviously is not the desired result. And this is why, see, now, it ends up which this is something that have always struck me as okay. So, wife of Pharaoh, a woman who was married to a very evil man, and she was pious, and the Pharaoh ends up torturing her to death, and she's actually, so it's not only that she was married to a treacherous man, but a very evil man. But then Surah Al-Tahrim ends with the prototype of the ideal and perfect woman, Maryam, who, and we've talked about the whole debate about whether Maryam was a prophet or not a prophet. But let's take the position that she wasn't a prophet. Maryam, whose piety as a single woman was such that she became the recipient of God's breath. So, look, He guarded her chastity, who breathed our spirit into that which was in her womb, and who accepted the truth of her sustainer''s words, and thus of God's revelation, and was one of the truly devout. It ends up with the prototype of the ideal, perfect woman who achieves luminosity without a man. In my view, that's not a coincidence. That's quite intentional. That that there will be occasions of those women, and by the way, Surah Al-Tahrim and this ending verse, it's not a coincidence that it ended up inspiring a lot of the Sufi women like Rabah al-Adawiyya and so on, that if I cannot walk the path to the Lord with a man, then in Surah Al-Tahrim and the ending of Surah Al-Tahrim, then I will walk it alone. Now think about the Umar reports about we were in Mecca, we controlled our women, and we came to Medina where we encountered a people controlled by their women. I'm very conservative about making wild claims about gender liberation and so on. But it's very fascinating that, which I said, that Surah Al-Tahrim, of all the narratives that tell us about the gender tensions, which ultimately culminated in the undue pressure being on the Prophet ﷺ, and then sort of God having to come in and intervene and say, okay, guys, cool it. We know that God, this man is very tolerant, gives you a lot of space, but it has become oppressive. Wake up and know who you're married to, because otherwise it's not going to work. This is effectively what happens in Surah Tahrim. It ends up, the ending of Surah Al-Tahrim is by affirming the ideal gender role of, what did we call it before? The Maryam's, what's it called? I don't think that, in my understanding of the Quran, where nothing is, I think that is quite intentional. Alhamdulillah, this is Surah Al-Tahrim completed. Alhamdulillah. Let me check I haven't forgotten anything, since I do tend to forget some things sometimes. Oh, yeah, this is just a note that I had written to myself too. Remember that in Surah Al-Hadid, which we've done a long time ago, that in Surah Al-Hadid, there is the affirmative dua as to the truly pious who say, يقولون ربنا أتمم لنا نورنا واغفر لنا إنك على كل شيء قدير. That in Surah Al-Hadid is the where Allah teaches you the affirmative normative dua that you pray for Allah to ever increase your luminosity. Luminosity, the light, is a process. It's an ongoing dynamic of purification and enlightenment. And so when we see it in Surah Al-Tahrim revisited, it harkens back to all that the Quran has taught us about the relationship of light and the moral project of the Quran. Okay, that's. Oh, one last thing. There are reports that Surah Al-Tahrim initially, there were reports that it was initially called Surah Al-Nabi, the Prophet's Surah. And that name was ultimately was not successful. Because I think that people understood that this surah, yes, it talked about the event and it talked about a problem initially, or the beginning of the surah, about a problem between the Prophet and his wives. But that was not the point of the surah. That the private dispute was being invoked for a far more significant moral point, that Allah quite intentionally did not want us to get stuck with what was the dispute about, who said what, who broke the confidence, and so on and so forth. Okay, alhamdulillah rabbil alameen. We're done.
Okay, alhamdulillah, that was amazing as always. It's really fascinating when we think back about what the last point you made about how all of this harkens back to even Surah Hadid was our very first surah on this journey on Project Illumine, and about purifying and light. And like in the last several surahs that we've done with Surah Nur and then Azab and then now Tahrim, it's so amazing that, we've gone this whole journey now. This is our 82nd surah, and like the theme of light now especially seems to have been, it's like a crescendo that we're reaching, and that the fascinating sort of interplay, because it's like, it's sort of genderless, right? I mean, God uses males and females, and even in this surah by itself, we start out thinking that there's an issue with the women, and then we end with the example of this, ideal woman that can go it alone, and like all of this empowerment and beauty that comes through these messages. So subhanallah, it's really what an incredible journey, honestly. So I guess what we'll do is then, we had 4 days of Surah Azab, then we never had our Q&A, so I'm sure, and we've gotten some Q&As sent to us, so, but adding that and then the surah now, I think we'll have, inshallah, a good amount to talk about at the next session. So we'll do our Q&A of both Ahzab and Tahrim next Tuesday, inshallah.
Inshallah.
And yeah, so please send questions that you have. What an incredible journey. And we're nearing the end of the summer, which is also amazing because I think these are the last couple weeks before kids go back to school, or some kids are already back in school. And we're going to have to start the new law school semester as well. So that will
Before I go back to
affect
school.
before you go back to school. So we'll probably have to go back to maybe one halaqah a week because it's going to be a demanding semester. So let us enjoy these last couple of weeks where we can hopefully have 2 halaqahs a week. And thank you, Sheikh, for this wonderful return to halaqahs. What a fabulous, short but powerful surah with so much for us to reflect on. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. And inshallah, we will hope to see you on Tuesday night. Inshallah. It's great to see everybody. Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum.